Hello, and welcome to the sixth lesson looking at the Anthology poetry from Year 10. This is looking at Extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. Now, if we were in class, I'd get you to look at these two quotes first, so we'll start with that. Wordsworth said, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility." He also said, "Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher." What can we learn from these quotations about Wordsworth's attitudes and viewpoints? So, as always, spend a few minutes looking at that, and you have a few seconds on the video. Okay, so this is the context, a little bit about William Wordsworth as a poet, and context is quite important for the Prelude, perhaps more so than some of the other poems. He was a romantic poet. We've seen romanticism in Shelley and Ozymandias. It's the idea of dealing with human emotions and the beauty of nature. And Wordsworth tried to explore humanity in the world around him, whilst also exploring the relationship between man and nature. Now, the reason he did this was because he grew up in the Lake District, and the Prelude, as it's called the Extract, basically is an autobiographical poem in which he looked at his own spiritual and moral development over the course of his life. Epic poems were quite common during this time period, or at least were more popular, and they often explored the world and man's place within it. So that's what Wordsworth sought to do with the Prelude. This is, it says here, it was completed in 1805, was intended to be a part of a three-part poem called The Recluse, which was never completed. So the Prelude was published in 1850 by Wordsworth's widow, and the extract comes from Book 1, Childhood and School Time. So this is autobiographical in nature, so you can still make an argument perhaps that there is a persona, as we've talked about in the past, yet this is pretty much Wordsworth talking about his own experiences and his own kind of ideas about the world that he lives in. The fact that it is an extract, remember, means that this is not the whole poem, it's just part of a poem that looks at a specific part of what we're looking at. So I'll read it out. It is a little bit long, but it is, again, another one where the actual narrative is quite straightforward, and one where you can hopefully get your head around what he's trying to say quite early on. "One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosened her chain, and stepping in pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, move slowly through my mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams." So we'll go straight into the analysis of this here. So firstly, there's some structural stuff at the end, but it's worth noting that it's first person because it is an autobiographical story. He is telling his story and what he experienced. One stanza, it emphasises to me how epic it is. It's a part of a whole epic poem, so it's part of like a whole journey of his life that he's looking at, therefore it's all as one stanza. There is no rhyme scheme and there's a lot of enjambment, remember enjambment being lines going on to the next line without a break. It's designed to be as if he's talking to us. He's regaling us with the story of his life. Now this, as I said, is more of a narrative poem. There's a story going on here about what happened, and the story fundamentally is him getting a boat and going out to the water. So we have this idea about the little boat tied to a willow tree. Could be the idea of the metaphor of man's control over nature. The idea that he tied up the boat to a willow tree is kind of maybe worth thinking about a bit more in terms of what that might say about the sort of the juxtaposition between man's power over nature and nature's power over man. But we get this idea straight away. He talks about the boat as a feminine. Firstly, so like her. So I unloosed her chain and stepping in, pushed from the shore, and it almost comes across, and you'll see it a bit more later on, almost like a love poem, like a love sort of ode to nature, the natural world, to the boat journey he's about to take. It starts in a way that's very, very beautiful and very, very pretty. You see it more with the idea of, leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. As he heads out, there's this really beautiful image of the moon in the water and the sparkling lights, and he's trying to set up this idea that it's calm, it's idyllic, and he's really, really enjoying this moment. It's interesting though, the idea of an act of stealth does imply that perhaps he shouldn't have actually been there in the first instance. So whilst he is describing it in a very positive way, there is this undercurrent that perhaps he shouldn't be there, and maybe it's, if you believe in kind of karmic ideas, perhaps that's why things don't go to plan as it goes on. This is an interesting part where he kind of talks about his skills in using the boat. He says, like one who rows proud of his skill. He's proud of himself because he fixes a chosen point, an unswerving line, he kind of heads towards a craggy ridge. That's kind of his boundary. That's where he's heading towards. The adjective, though, craggy here is rough and messy, I've said. It's the first hint, I guess, of the negative description, and it's the limit of his journey. Basically, if he's going to go out on the water and he's out, say, on a lake, he's in the Lake District, possibly Windermere. He's suggesting, this is the boundary, and the boundary itself is a craggy ridge, and it brings that first hint of negative description. Yet it's completely, undermined, but it's completely kind of drawn back to the idea of the, nothing but the stars and the grey sky. And you can argue the grey being quite potentially a negative colour as well. But in this instance, it's all building a sense of kind of the tranquility of nature. This is where we see perhaps some more of the more kind of loving vocabulary and almost the more sensual vocabulary used towards the boat journey and the boat. We have the idea of the elfin pinnace. It's a metaphor for ferry boat, and it is a play on words. And remember, this is about him growing older. This is about him being a boy and potentially progressing into being a man. So you might want to think about some of the symbolism being talked about here. He lustily dipped his oars and the boat went heaving through the water, all very, very, I said it's somewhat almost sexual or passionate, the enjoyment he's having. It's not saying that he enjoys boats necessarily. What it's just suggesting is that there's a sensualness to the movement of cutting through the water in the skill that he is, this tranquil evening with the stars and the moonlight. And it is almost like an ode to this night at this moment, although things do change. He uses the idea of like a swan, like the boat is moving in an elegant, kind of natural. He's at one with nature at this point. He might as well be part of the natural world that he is celebrating. Although he then sees a huge peak, black and huge. Now, the connotations here being, so this is just basically for those who aren't sure about a peak, it's just a big mountain effectively. So he sees this thing looming out of the distance. And the connotations there of, sort of the size and the colour of being scary, bad, negative. Also, it's interesting because for someone who's been quite good with words so far, he repeats the word huge, which firstly I would say is quite a straightforward word to use to describe something. But the fact that he repeats it implies that it is so awe-inspiring and so impressive to see in front of him that it almost means that he can't quite verbalise how he feels. Even worse than the colours and the size is the fact that it says here, upreared its head. It personifies it. It's as if he's sailing around on the boat, and then he sees this mountain suddenly. It comes out of nowhere as if a monster's raised its head, adding further to the negative connotations. So he continues to row, and he talks about the grim shape of the mountain. So again, this adjective grim here sort of implying that it is a negative aspect of this kind of whole beautiful scene of the mountains and the moon and the lake and the stars. And it towers up between me and the stars, and it kind of blocks off what he was seeing. And he says it measured motion like a living thing strode after me. So it's as if he's being followed, because no matter where he goes on the lake, he can still see this thing. And it emphasises that the mountain's size, of course, because if it was that big, you'd be able to see it from everywhere. But it makes him feel like he is being watched, he is being followed. It's obviously a simile of the like a living thing, but you have the sort of the metaphor or personification, I guess, of the mountain, the idea of the mountain striding after him. It's as if he's being followed by something, and this big ominous something as well. So as we go on, he talks about trembling oars, the idea that he is quite scared of what he's seen, and he goes back to the cover of the willow tree. The willow tree here, whilst before we had the idea of it being tied up and perhaps looking at the power of man or the power of nature, this here represents safety. It's away from the natural world. He's come off of the lake, he's away from the mountain. And he kind of goes away, and even though he had enjoyed what had happened up to that point, he leaves in grave and serious mood. So he is quite upset, quite saddened by what he's seen, and he is shaken. And it doesn't just affect him on the water, it affects him, as we'll see in the last few lines, going forward in life. And he even goes as far to talk about the idea of there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. The idea of solitude or desertion, I guess, being kind of abstract nouns for like feelings and things he can't necessarily touch. He feels depressed and lonely due to this experience. It makes him feel small and insignificant, perhaps. And he goes to this last bit here. He says, no familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. He sees the natural world differently now compared to the beginning. He believes in its beauty still, but now having seen kind of this ominous mountain that appeared out of nowhere, it has turned him into someone who's perhaps more cynical about the natural world around him. And it says here, huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men move slowly through the mind by day, were a trouble to my dreams. So the impact of what he saw didn't just affect him then, didn't just affect him when he left, but in the days that followed and in his nightmares, or I guess dreams here, but in dreams that turned into nightmares, he began to fear the power of nature to the point of having these nightmares. So as always, I've got a little red box which just kind of tries to summarise it in sort of 30 words or so. The poet goes onto the lake to enjoy nature and solitude, but is haunted by the sight of a big mountain. This causes him feelings of depression and loneliness, as he is upset about his own irrelevance compared to the power of nature. Now, this is another one where you can interpret it how you see fit. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the idea of him being a young boy, going into turning into being a sort of a man, or at least a teenager, potentially at this point. So it could be kind of the naivety of a child going into the slightly more difficult lifestyle and changes in the life that you have when you're a teenager or an adult. Could be that. It could be literally him trying to explore the different sides of the natural world, how the nature can be beautiful but also scary. It could just be about how, I guess, things can change quite quickly from seemingly being quite wonderful and quite lovely and beautiful and calm to these sort of darker clouds and sort of darker issues that might attack you or kind of get into your head and ruin your day and stuff like that. It's kind of up to you to what extent you sort of take that metaphor. I've always quite liked the idea of it exploring ideas around adolescence and changing from being a child to a teenager, but that's just my interpretation. On the last slide here, just it kind of expands a little bit more on the structure. The idea here saying that this poem is actually written in blank verse, and I've not used that term before, but blank verse basically means there's no real rhyme scheme, no specific rhythm scheme, and yeah, the idea of the lots of enjambment. It says no. I said no rhythm scheme, but actually, so blank verse is more to do with the fact that there's no rhyme scheme. But actually, there is a rhythm scheme here, which is the iambic pentameter. Now, because of the enjambment, what often happens is you don't tend to hear iambic pentameter, but what it is, it's the 10 syllables. It's the da-dum, 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 and it's supposed to sound somewhat like the heart beating. So again, if you're thinking about him telling his sort of biographical story, if you think about him talking about like changes from going maybe from a child to getting older, if you're talking about ideas around our position in the natural world, the idea of using iambic pentameter plays quite nicely into ideas about what he might be exploring about being human and being a person. And it links back quite nicely to what he's saying here in this quote, and you might want to sort of think about it in your own time. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. And he is clearly trying to explore that idea within this autobiographical poem. And that's the poem. Again, it's a long one and there are some challenging bits in it, but in terms of the narrative, as I said, it is kind of a straightforward story being told. And from that, you can hang some of your analysis. And again, it's about finding those deeper kind of meanings, like what is he saying about power, conflict? What is he saying about humanity, nature? What is he saying about himself as a person? As always, any questions, concerns, please let me know. And I'll post up a couple more videos either later this week or start of next week. Okay, bye.